Hello, welcome to the fourth video in this series. You may remember from the last video that when we were looking at the compiled output from our JSX, that React.Fragment kind of popped out of nowhere. What we're going to do in this video is have a little look at that. What is React.Fragment? We're not going to go into a lot of depth because that would require us to know about some topics we haven't got to yet, namely keys and components. So this is more just an introduction to it. Okay, so where did React.Fragment pop out from? Well, if we look at this and we take what we already know, React.Fragment is part of the outermost element. And if we look at the left side, the outermost element and also the most suspicious looking element are these just empty tags. And that is, yes, in fact, where it's coming from. If I change this to a div, that React.Fragment has changed to a div. So it is these outermost empty tags which are causing that. And also something we covered in the last video, but probably worth repeating, is the fact that these empty tags are spitting out React.Fragment. That's just the default value for TypeScript. If we're using JSX in not with React but with something else, then we can just change that TypeScript config to say when you see this syntax, then use this kind of reference instead. Cool, so let's take a little example that's using the fragment syntax and have a little play with it. So I'm going to take the JavaScript that generated, jump over to the React website where we know that the React APIs are just available in the global scope, and let us play with it immediately just in our browser console. Then paste those elements in to be rendered into the body, remove that semicolon. There we go, rendered. And then if we take a look at the document, we can see we've got the body, and then immediately inside that body got the header and the paragraph. If we jump back, so all that was rendered into the body was the header and the paragraph. There's no signs of the fragment. That's kind of vanished now. And that's the purpose of the fragment. It's like an empty tag to kind of make that clear as well, that it doesn't actually construct any elements itself. Its purpose is purely to, when you're in a situation like this where I've got two elements, or many elements, and I want to group them all up together into one element. And we could stop there and say, when you're in that situation, you've got many things or siblings of each other, and you want to group them all up, then wrap them in a fragment. And we're done. But let's go into just a little bit more depth than that. The first thing you might be thinking is, hang on a second, don't we already have a way of grouping things together? Why did we have to introduce a whole new thing to do that? We've been using arrays to do that. And you're right, fragments are a lot like arrays. But if we try and use an array instead, it works, but we hit a few things. So this is like, element 1 is that way, and if we use an array, we're getting some errors here, and that's because this array is just standard JavaScript syntax, and we need to follow the standard JavaScript syntax rules of using arrays. We need to use commas to separate the values. What I mean by that. So between this first value and this second value, we need to put a comma in to kind of help distinguish up between the different items in the array. So whereas with the fragment, because the fragment here already kind of puts us into a JSX syntax mode, that mode knows that this is the first element, and that first element's now come to an end, and now we're on to the second one. So it can distinguish between each thing quite easily that way. It's just that's how XML works. Whereas when we're using an array, we've got to use commas, which may not seem like the end of the world, but it can be a little bit confusing because, if you imagine there's quite a lot of stuff on the screen and it's not immediately obvious that this is being wrapped in arrays or a fragment, you get, for something that looks very similar, you're going to get very different results. So I can put a comma here, but the comma there in the side of the fragment has actually put a string out that's being treated as a literal. You're typing text, you want text to actually be put onto the screen and shown to the user. Whereas the comma here is a JavaScript comma here separating the values, but they look almost identical. Well, they are identical. So it can be a source of like a very subtle bug or just design issue. So that can be a little bit frustrating. The other thing is you see this with text. So here, if I want to say that there's some text between these two things, I can just write that text in, just like I can in HTML, and that's created that there. Whereas here again, I'm not this is JSX, but as soon as I hit that comma, I'm now back to kind of JavaScript, pure, just standard JavaScript mode. So if I write some text here, it's getting really confused because it's trying to interpret this as JavaScript syntax. Whereas what I actually want is that to be a string. So I now need to quote all my just literal bits of text. So that's a bit annoying. But that all said, it does actually, if we look at what actually happens, if I take this and jump over here and render that array, as we've seen before, it does work. So it's definitely very much about a usability thing rather than an actual technical does it work or not. Another thing you might be thinking is, where did the name fragment come from? So it comes from the DOM API, where you have a thing called a document fragment. So you can do document.create document fragment. And if I show an example of how we'd use that one, here we create that fragment, and then got two elements here, and then I can append those two elements to that fragment, and then I can say document body, but now append that fragment to the body. And then if we look at the result, those two things have now been appended to the body as if we did them individually, as if I'd said body append header, body append paragraph. And that's the kind of reason we want the fragment here, is because it's in the document, the live kind of document, every time we append something to it, there's a bit of a cost involved in that because it triggers some calculations. So if even though we could have appended these things, here we could have done document body append header, document body append paragraph, that would have produced the same result in the end. Doing each one individually, especially if you imagine you've got hundreds of them, there's a bit of a cost to doing that. Whereas appending those to the fragment, which is cheap because the fragment's not a live document, it's just a fragment, means that I can then append all of those things kind of in one go. So it's a similar type of concept when we're using fragments in our JSX. The fragment is just like collecting up a bunch of things ready to be attached to some parent at a next stage. So that's why they have the same name. But key thing to remember is they have the same name, but it's not actually creating document fragments. That syntax doesn't mean use document fragments. And React might choose to use fragments for certain situations internally, but that's going to be happening regardless of if you're using the fragment syntax. So they're kind of conceptually the same type of thing, but it doesn't literally mean please create me a document fragment. What we can do now is just quickly apply what we've learned to the to-do app that we're slowly building up. So what we had got to so far was using an array to collect together everything. And let's fragmentize it. So wrapped up in a fragment, and as we can see, don't get any errors, but there are now little commas in between everything on the screen. So if I zoom that in, see the little commas. So let's just take those out. Oh, that one we need. And there we go. So we've now got a to-do app. A little bit neater than it was before using fragment syntax. The last thing I wanted to cover is the fact that these little empty tags like this are more syntactic sugar, kind of on top of already JSX kind of being syntactic sugar for something you can already just type. And what they're sugar for is writing this. So do that, close it. We can see that if I wrote that, it's generated the exact same thing over here. So do here, to empty. Now it's whether I use the empty syntax or the kind of full name, it doesn't matter after you've compiled that to standard JavaScript. You end up with the exact same thing. There's, React can't tell the difference. It doesn't know which version you're using. It's purely, as I said, syntactic sugar. It's sweeter to write things like this. That's visually more pleasing than having to write all of that every time. So a subtle thing that this kind of starts to get us onto is, again, it's kind of how, normally when we write tags in here, they end up as strings. So if I made this a div, I ended up with a string, whereas when I wrote this, it's preserved it exactly in place. So this is referencing React.Fragment and getting whichever value that's pointing at and passing that to create element. So how did it know to do that? And here there's kind of two, well, in this case I think it's the dot that's telling it to do that. I think here if we wrote div dot something, then the dot is now saying, I'm trying to reference something as I create this element. The type that I'm telling that element to be should be whatever this is pointing at. Execute this little bit of JavaScript and use the value that ends up being. The other way that things know whether to go into that mode is if you use a capital letter. So say up here I'd already done var fragment equals react.fragment. That was how it was imported. Here I do fragment. Then here that's worked, and it's as simple as it looks at that first letter, and the fact it starts with a capital letter is what tells JSX I'm trying to actually refer to a variable. If I use a lowercase letter, it thinks you're trying to refer to something that kind of already, you're just using a string and saying, I'm telling you the name fragment, I think you know how to make one of those. Whereas, if I put a capital letter here, or any capital letter, they're all good, that goes into this mode. I'm not going to go too much more into that, but that kind of sets us up quite nicely in the next video when we start looking at components.